have a special edition of the Friday Forum. We have Brother Ramin here from the CARE organization. He will be discussing, this will be a Know Your Rights kind of lecture. He'll be discussing some of, just in light of the recent events that have been going on, he'll be discussing just some of our civil rights in regards to travel and what to do if you're being approached by ICE. Before I turn to him, there's a couple of announcements that we just wanted to make. Inshallah, starting on this Sunday, Sheikh Osama will be having a Ramadan primer just to prepare for Ramadan. This will be going on for the next 3 weeks before Ramadan gets started. And then we also have on February 12th, we have our next planning board meeting in regards to the masjid expansion. We encourage everybody to come to that event. With that, I will pass it to Brother Ramin.
All right. Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. How's everyone doing? So we've been getting a lot of requests by masajid to do more kind of Know Your Rights events where we go over, just share general information about people's rights, and particularly related to the recent escalation of incidents that have been going on with ICE enforcement, particularly in Minnesota, where we've seen a lot of pretty extreme actions taken by ICE. And so a lot of people are concerned, rightfully so, about what to do if they ever encounter ICE, and how to handle those situations. And we're also going to be talking about general travel practices and rights, because that's also a problem that we've seen in our community. A lot of people have been getting visas canceled. A lot of travel bans have been instituted for various countries and people. And so we want to make sure that people are prepared when they go to travel to the airport or to the border and things like that. So that's kind of the reason why we're here today, to just trying to spread more information. And normally we would go into a bit more about CARE as an organization, but because we have a lot to cover this time, I'll just keep it brief. So these are, so CARE New Jersey is, CARE New Jersey is the New Jersey chapter of the broader Council on American Islamic Relations, where our mission is threefold. One, to enhance understanding of Islam. Two, to promote justice in our community and also more broadly. And three, to empower American Muslims to be able to be more civically engaged, to know their rights and whatnot. And so we normally go into more about the work that we're doing, but like I said, there's a lot to get into in the Know Your Rights substance. So we do a lot of government advocacy, government affairs, advocacy, legal work, things like that, media engagement. Okay. So for the actual Know Your Rights, just want to be clear that this is not, I'm not here to present any legal advice, just because that would be tailored to individual people in particular circumstances. This is more just kind of general information that might, you might be able to use in if you ever encounter ICE, or if you ever encounter a CBP agent at the airport asking you questions or things like that. So if you feel like you're at risk, it's definitely important to talk to an immigration attorney to get individualized legal advice. But for now, we're just going to share general information about your rights. So we're dealing with essentially two agencies that are part of the broader Department of Homeland Security, right? So when it comes to traveling, we're dealing with the Customs and Border Protection, otherwise known as CBP. You would encounter them at the airport or at the border, and they're just generally the ones that engage in that domain. And then we're also going to be talking about ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So these are all like three different agencies in the Department of Homeland Security. Another one you might be familiar with is USCIS, which deals with like immigration benefits, green cards, citizenship, things like that. But we're not going to be getting into USCIS that much, since we're mostly going to be talking about interactions with ICE agents and CBP agents in the different contexts that you might see them. But first we'll begin with CBP. But yeah, and then generally what we've seen in the Trump administration so far is a lot of more aggressive ICE enforcement, as I mentioned, as all of you've probably seen in the news and social media and whatnot. A lot more scrutiny of people's applications for visas, immigration benefits, things like that, and a lot more slower processing. So we're seeing it take much longer for people to get visas or to get citizenship or things like that. A lot more slow, processing for that, and a lot more problems at the border or at ports of entry. People experiencing more questioning, a lot more random kind of or seemingly random cancellation of visas and things like that. We've also seen non-renewal of certain protections like temporary protected status, people on parole, which was extended to people from certain nationalities, but now it's being revoked. That protected status is being revoked. And a lot more travel restrictions. So the result is definitely a lot of like uncertainty, more fear about how these policies are unfolding, and a lot of people caught off guard when they want to travel or just kind of going about their day-to-day business and are encounter ICE and things like that. And so this is why it's important to be prepared, and why we're kind of doing all these Know Your Rights presentations around the state. So what is CBP? CBP refers, like I said, the Customs and Border Protection. It's part of the DHS, and it operates at airports, borders, and ports of entry, and it controls who may enter the United States. And it has broad authority during travel, so there's a lot of powers that it has that other law enforcement wouldn't have because of the special nature of a border and how they want to kind of, protect national security. So they have more abilities at that border than a regular law enforcement agent would have within the country to enforce the law here. And as many of you may have experienced or may have heard, they frequently, engage in discriminatory conduct towards, Muslims, people perceived as being foreign, and so it creates a lot of fear and uncertainty when you're traveling. So these are just some important steps to take before you travel. If you have an immigration case or any sort of prior issues with traveling, like you've received extra questioning or extra searches and things like that, you've had your devices seized or other property seized by CBP in the past, it's important to talk to an attorney before traveling so you are more prepared for how to go through that process again to be able to preserve your rights. It's important to carry proper identification. Now more recently they've required real IDs for entering or for boarding flights. Before that was not required, and now everyone has to get that. So either you need some sort of federalized ID, either a real ID or a passport. And non-citizens should be extra careful to make sure they carry, their green cards or visas. A lot of people, this, might seem obvious, but unfortunately, we've seen a lot of cases where this is a problem, like people not carrying the proper documentation. And it's also important to carry emergency contact information, preferably of that attorney that you would be speaking with before traveling, so to carry that information with you in case you need to contact them for any difficulty at any sort of detention or things of that nature or questioning. Regarding electronic devices, so CBP has the authority to search those devices without a warrant. Like I said, in other contexts, like law enforcement within the country might require a warrant to search these devices. Essentially, they would need to get permission from a judge. Then they would have to give reason why they want to search the device. In the case of CBP, they don't need that sort of authorization. They can essentially just, for any sort of basic level of suspicion, seize someone's electronic device during international travel. And so that's why we recommend a lot of times that people, if they don't want any sort of liability to arise from any sort of information they might have on their electronic devices, that it's best to generally avoid traveling with them if possible. But of course, in our day and age, it's kind of difficult to do that, to, not bring our phones or laptops or things like that while we're traveling. So if that's absolutely, necessary, if there's no way to get around traveling with your electronic device, then it's important that you use, a very high level of encryption and other forms of protection on your device to prevent it from being able to be hacked into by CBP agents. Using a strong password is useful. A lot of times we just use our face to get in our phones, or have thumbprint or whatever other way of getting in, or just like a 4-digit or 6-digit code. But it's important that before you're traveling to have a strong password. This really makes it a lot more difficult for them to be able to access your phone if they do seize your device or laptop or other device. And it's important for it to be quite long so that you can, the longer it is, essentially the harder it'll be for them to get access to the device. A lot of times when you try to make a password for like a new account or something, sometimes you're suggested like a very long list of numbers and letters that are kind of random. But the problem with those is that while they're very strong passwords, it's very hard to remember those passwords if you ever forget it. So there's a lot of websites out there or that might generate like an easy to remember long password. So I've seen people give advice about like a password that's just a stream of seemingly unconnected and random words that would be easy to remember, but it's very long, so that it would take a long time or be extra difficult for CBP to be able to get into that phone. So that's just one idea. And also if you turn off your phone before you anticipate going through security, then if they were to take your phone and turn it back on, usually it automatically would require a password to enter the phone. So that just prevents any sort of, just makes it extra safe. And another thing to mention is that deleting data, it doesn't really ensure your privacy, because most government agencies are able to recover data that's been deleted. So they can go into the phone, get data that has been deleted through their various methods, because it typically leaves some sort of trace on the devices. So don't think that, okay, if I just delete everything on my phone, it'll be okay, I don't need to worry about it. They still can use methods to get that information. And why does this matter? Because we've seen people, face immigration consequences simply by, stuff they post on social media, messages they've sent on WhatsApp or other messaging services. So things that are perfectly legal, that should not be a basis for the government, denying people visas or denying people entry or causing people problems in traveling. All these things we've seen used by the government, especially under the Trump administration, to prevent people to just cause difficulty. So like I said, a lot of things that we might think are not a problem, they consider to be a problem and have been using it to just did not cause people routine problems with visas and with traveling and whatnot. So regarding questioning, many of you, if you go through the customs when you're coming back from international travel, you'll get the routine questions like identity, like the purpose of your travel, the destination, how long you were away, things like that. They'll ask all these questions. It's important to answer these questions truthfully, because lying to federal agents is a crime. So they, for whatever reason, if you were to be dishonest to them, it could come around to harm you in the future. So it's best to be honest. But it's also important not to give any additional information based on beyond those basic questions that they ask, right? So they'll ask those questions that I mentioned, but sometimes they might start asking inappropriate questions, like questions about your political beliefs, about your religious beliefs. We've seen people be asked like which masjid do you go to, are you Sunni or Shia, things like that. We've had people ask these questions at the airport. We've seen that, and so those are definitely inappropriate questions that you should not feel the need to answer. And in fact, it's better not to answer them at all, just to refuse to answer them. And you can simply say, I'm not comfortable answering that question, you know, and then that should, you know, send the message that you don't want to delve into those personal matters that they have no business asking about. Basically, anything that's not relevant to your travel, they should not be asking about those questions. And if the questioning continues, you know, you should definitely speak with an attorney. It might be possible to call them depending on the circumstance. When it comes to searching of possessions, so everything on your person or in your luggage can be searched. They can go through your luggage, they can go through any bags or anything like that. And the devices, like we mentioned, could be searched or seized. You can ask that the search happen in front of you, because sometimes they might, you know, take it off to some sort of other room to do the search, and it might be better, it might be more advantageous for you to be able to see what they're doing, so you could document it and, you know, remember what's happening, and then be able to, you know, tell an attorney about what happened more specifically. If a device is seized, you can always ask for a receipt. They usually have to give you a piece of paper that denotes what was seized, gives like just general information for how you can expect to retrieve it. It's important to write down the officer's name and badge number and date and location of this incident of the seizure of the device, just because then you can use that later for any sort of a complaint that you might want to file to the Department of Homeland Security about the incident that you faced. And just to be clear, you're never required to give them your password to your laptop or to your phone. A lot of times they try to trick people into giving them their password. They say, you know, you have to do it. It's required. They, you know, say, okay, we'll stop bothering you. This will all end if you just give us your password. But that's oftentimes not true. They could keep on questioning you if they wanted. And also they can seize your device. Whether or not you give them the password, they can take it anyway. So it's just generally best not to share, give them access to your phone or laptop or any device that they want access to. Yeah, exactly. And regarding searches of the person, you can request that the search be done by an officer of the same gender. And you can also ask that it be done in a private room, not in front of other people. And yeah, like you can ask, when it comes to like religious clothing, like a hijab or whatnot, you can request that they do a wand search, or to take you to a private area so that you don't get exposed in front of the public. So a lot of times people who repeatedly experience problem like secondary screening, where they are always, you know, taken into a room for questioning, or experience other delays like, you know, extra searching, extra questioning, things like that, or routinely have delays in their travel. It could be that because they're placed on a government watch list of some kind, and just, you know, that's something to be wary of. You know, if you routinely face these problems every time you travel, that might be the reason why, and that'd be important to then go to an attorney to speak about that issue. And of course, this goes without being said, but, you know, your immigration status is very important, and it really matters at the border or port of entry or airport. So if you're a green card holder, of course, you shouldn't be, you know, out of the country for more than 6 months. If you do, it would, you know, cause them to be suspicious and, you know, ask you questions, you know, scrutinize your travels a bit more. And with visa holders, CBP has discretion to admit or deny you that just because you have a visa doesn't mean that you're guaranteed entry. As we've seen a lot of times, especially during the Trump administration, people have been having their visas revoked just right at the port of entry by the CBP agent. So that's just something to keep in mind, that it's generally better not to travel if you are not a citizen, because of what we've been seeing in the Trump administration, that they could, even if you have a visa, they could just revoke it or things like that. We've seen that unfortunately happen more and more frequently. And people who are undocumented, you know, you might think it might be safe to do domestic traveling, but that you might also be detained during that domestic travel. So it's for undocumented individuals, people without any status, it's important to consider that and potentially avoid all air travel if you want to avoid any sort of detention, immigration detention. And like I said, if you're feeling harassed or targeted, you can always record the name and badge number of the agent. Keep track of the information about what happened, exactly what kind of questions they asked you, things like that. Like as soon as you're, done with the process, maybe just, write it down so you don't forget. Note anyone who witnessed the incident. All this information could help you in the future if, you want to go to an attorney and seek some sort of possible relief for the problems that or the harassment or abuse that you faced. Another mechanism, or a primary mechanism that's often used is what's called DSA TRIP. So it's a portal on the Department of Homeland Security website where you document what happened in your experience or in your travels, and if you were faced any sort of inappropriate questions or excessive searches and screening, or if you were denied boarding onto a flight, that you can express those grievances on that. And if you go to an attorney who specializes in this field, they could very much help you with this. And then you can contact us or any other organization that deals with this, like the Clear Clinic in New York also deals with this kind of issues, to help with how to navigate this problem. Okay, so before that, before we get into ICE, if anyone has any questions about the traveling, now would be the time. We can also go back at the end. So regarding ICE, like I mentioned, there's multiple agencies within the Department of Homeland Security. ICE is one of them. It stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They enforce the immigration laws within the United States, so they're not meant to be at the border, screening people as they enter, but rather enforcing immigration laws inside the U.S. And one important thing to understand about ICE is that it often works with other law enforcement agencies, including the local police. So a lot of times you don't really know who you're dealing with when especially with recent tactics where ICE agents have just been showing up with masks or unmarked cars or things like that. Sometimes it's difficult to know which agent or which agency you're even dealing with. And ICE's actions frequently cause fear in the community, and that fear often extends beyond the people that ICE has been targeting. And we've been seeing that in the past year or so, where it's having a bleeding effect. It's really causing fear and uncertainty for everyone, even if they're U.S. citizens. So, and this fear is definitely by design. So they intend to create this environment because they believe it makes their job easier, that people will be discouraged from coming into the country illegally, that this is all part of the tactics that they use. And these are two major divisions within Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You have the enforcement and removal operations. They handle arrest, detention, and deportation. And then you have the Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, which handles investigations and sometimes criminal enforcement when that overlaps with immigration-related issues. And like I said, in real life, sometimes you don't know who you're dealing with. They don't sometimes they don't wear badges, sometimes they don't have any sort of identifying insignia or things like that. And oftentimes they don't explain who they're part of, which agency they're part of, especially when they're trying to hide their identity, which has been very common lately. So that's why it's important to know your rights regardless of which law enforcement agency you're dealing with, because a lot of your rights are the same regardless of who you're dealing with. So ICE often relies on surprise and confusion. So they'll show up in unmarked cars. They might show up early in the morning to a place, or they might even pretend to be a completely different agency. They just use a lot of different tactics to sow confusion among the people they're targeting. They sometimes conduct what's known as a collateral arrest, which means that they arrest people that they weren't originally looking for, but that they end up finding out that they would, want to detain them for one reason or another. They try to get information from people's phones or from third parties, so people who might know information about you that you might be undocumented or things like that. But a key thing to remember is that ICE often relies on consent to search places rather than having warrants, and that's something we'll get into, the difference between, like the warrants that they tend to use and things like that. So ICE claims to target non-citizens who are deportable. So this includes like people who have no lawful status in the country, people who've violated the terms of their status that they had, or people who maybe missed an immigration court date or things like that. They also prioritize people with certain criminal convictions or prior removal orders, or who they claim to be threats to national security. But in practice, the enforcement often impacts a lot more people than what they say. Of course, it includes, like, it has an impact on the families of these people, on the bystanders, and in some cases, even U.S. citizens end up being targeted because of mistake of identity or misidentification, things like that. Like we've seen in some cases recently, and especially Minnesota, where there's been a lot of escalation of tensions between ICE and the community. We've seen some U.S. citizens detained for a day or two in immigration detention because they think that they're someone else who's undocumented. So that's why a lot of times it's best to maybe carry some sort of proof of citizenship if you are a U.S. citizen, because then this might prevent this outcome from happening. So you could carry a passport, but that's kind of tough. I recently saw this video where this guy he like taped his passport to his forehead to try to show everyone, I'm a U.S. citizen, don't mess with me. You don't have to do that. You can you don't have to go that far, but you can maybe carry around. I've seen these passport cards, which are much smaller than a passport. They could easily fit in your wallet. You can't use it the same way a passport would be used. You can't travel internationally with it. Or besides like land crossings into Canada and Mexico, but at least you can use the passport card as a proof of citizenship that's very easy to carry around. So in case, if you're in an area that has a lot of ICE activity, you can easily show this to them, and if they end up, wanting to detain you, and it might, prevent any sort of problems from taking place. Yeah. So these, one second. Okay. So these images aren't working, but that's fine, because the more important images later are okay. But so like I mentioned earlier, in order for ICE to get into a private place, whether that's your home or like a private business, or a masjid also counts as a private space because it's owned by private individuals. The public at large, not everyone has a right to enter it. That you need permission from the owners of the place. In order to get access to these sorts of places, to search it or to to arrest the people that they're looking for, they need either the permission of the people who own that place or who live in the house or whatnot, or they need a warrant that is issued by a judge, signed by a judge, that gives them permission to enter that specific place. Either of these two things gives them access to the place, and typically they don't have a judicial warrant. So they tend to kind of pretend to have a judicial warrant, essentially, by carrying around a different kind of warrant that isn't really a warrant at all, but has the word warrant on it. So this this kind of paper, it says warrant on it, but it's really from the Department of Homeland Security. It's not from a judge, right? So it does not actually allow them to enter those private spaces, but they tend to use it to trick people into thinking that they have permission to enter, and then people end up giving them permission, and then they end up entering and doing whatever they want in that place. So just to be clear, only a warrant that is coming from a courthouse that's signed by a judge would give ICE authority to enter a place without someone's consent. And so you should never assume that they have it. Always, you need to ask for that kind of warrant for them to show it, actually. So this might be hard to see for some people, but this shows the difference between an ICE warrant and a judicial warrant, right? So on the left, you have a document that says warrant for arrest of alien. But on the top left, if you can see, it says U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So this warrant is from the Department of Homeland Security. It's not from a judge or anything like that. And it's signed by an agent that's part of ICE. So it's signed by someone within the agency that gives them permission to enter or to arrest someone. This does not authorize them to be able to enter a private place. Whereas the document on the right, on the top, it very clearly says United States District Court. It says search warrant, and then it has a signature of a judge at the bottom, and it specifically states, what is, being searched, right? So it has to include with particularity, what is this object of the search. And so so that's what is needed, and that's what they should produce if they want to enter private places, but they often don't have that because judges typically don't give warrants for this purpose. So that's why they tend to use this other tactic as a sort of trick to get people to permission to enter into their place, their private place. So that's why it's important to always ask them to produce the warrant, to read it, to make sure that it's specific to the place that they're in and not some other random place, and that it's not actually like a ICE or a DHS warrant. So this is also something to consider is ICE when you're in your car, because we've seen a lot of incidents where people are just in their cars, ICE shows up, maybe is very aggressive, the person isn't cooperating with ICE, they end up smashing their windows, things like that, being very aggressive. So it's important to know what your rights are in that context, because it's a bit different from if you're in a house or a private place. So ICE doesn't need a warrant to stop a car. They just need, but it still has to be a lawful stop. And the basis for what makes a stop lawful is something called reasonable suspicion. They need to have some reasonable belief that there is some sort of criminal activity going afoot. So that's the kind of requirement that they need, but they don't need a warrant to stop the car. But to search the car, they generally need consent or a judicial warrant, like the same thing with the house, but also some sort of probable cause of criminal activity might give them permission to search without consent. This is all a kind of complicated analysis, but essentially they generally would need consent to search the vehicle. Regarding IDs, so only the driver is required to show the ID. They might ask all the passengers for ID, but the passengers don't need to give it. They can always ask, am I free to leave? Because really it's mainly the driver who's being stopped. The passengers can always ask, am I free to leave? If they say yes, the passenger wants, they can exit the situation if they feel more comfortable with that. And of course, everyone has the right to remain silent. This is something that is going to be consistent throughout all these situations, is that if you're ever detained by ICE, that you have the right to not incriminate yourself by speaking with them. So the goal is generally to stay safe and stay calm and not, have to over-explain your situation. You can clearly say, I don't consent to a search. You can ask to see a search warrant if they want to search your car. it's always important to be very clear with them. So if you don't want them to search your car, you should say, I don't consent to search. If you don't want to speak to them about, if after you're being detained, you can say, I wish to remain silent. I don't want to speak. Or something that might really scare them is I invoke my Fifth Amendment right. Any sort of legal language might, show them that you're very aware that this right comes from the Constitution and that they can't, force you to say anything against your interest, right? So regarding schools, they're not absolutely safe from ICE. We've seen, especially in the Trump administration, a lot of enforcement actions taking place in the schools, but there are more protections in schools than there would be in other places. So in New Jersey specifically, there's been directives to generally not allow ICE into buildings or non-public areas without a warrant, specifically judicial warrant. And like before, those administrative ICE warrants that they might use to trick people into giving them permission, those are not required, or those are not enough to give them permission to enter the school. ICE can still take action if they have lawful authority, and the school cannot physically block them from entering, unfortunately. And there's been some legislation, like for example with the outgoing governor, to try to designate schools as a safe place, but these things are still being implemented. It's not really clear how that can inform or how the implementation is going to go. It's still kind of up in the air, and just the general advice is to is that preparation is very important, to have an emergency plan and know how to reach an immigration attorney in all of these situations if there's ever any ICE encounters. Regarding the workplace, so it's kind of the same as other private places, is that in this case, the employer would be the one that would need to give permission to them to enter, or they would need to have a judicial warrant, which since they usually don't, your employer would be the one that would decide whether or not to give them permission to enter the workplace. And if someone, if consent is given, they may be able to stay in the workplace and conduct whatever operations they want. A lot of times we see that when ICE enters a workplace, a lot of people who might be afraid of being detained for whatever reason end up making a run for the exit. They all kind of storm out of the building, but it's important to not do this, right? Because it might escalate the situation. ICE agents might end up using aggressive means to stop the people from running, and that might be dangerous. So it's generally best not to run in that context. And always at any point with all these encounters, you can always ask the ICE agent specifically, am I free to go? Am I being detained, right? This makes them decide whether or not they are placing you under arrest. If they're not placing you under arrest, that means you can leave the situation if you wish. So this is always a good, important question to ask. If they say you're not free to go, then essentially they're saying that you are arrested, and therefore they'd have to, they could be liable for, some false arrest if the arrest is not legally authorized. So that's why sometimes when you ask them this question, they try to get around it. They try to dodge the question, avoid it. They try not to ask this or answer the question. That's why it's important to ask it, because then and repeat if they don't answer, to repeat yourself, so they're forced to tell you whether you are free to go or not. And then if you are, you can always leave the situation and slowly and calmly, not aggressively or not in a run or anything like that. And like in all the other situations, right to remain silent. You don't have to say anything to them that would incriminate you. And so. And just like with any other situation like the schools, it's always important to have some sort of, plan to maybe deny access to them, like maybe if you have a good relationship with your employer, you can speak to them ahead of time and be like, we'd appreciate it if you ahead of time decide not to give ICE permission to enter this workplace. And of course, you can always ask to speak with an attorney at any point. Like, so if you're ever detained, if you have the contact information, you should use it. So this is, if you're ever detained, this kind of goes over the different rights that you have. It's a lot of it's repeated from, what we've mentioned already. So if you're detained, you should remain silent. And it's important to specifically say, like I said, I want to remain silent. Sometimes just sitting there and being quiet, doesn't really count as invoking your Fifth Amendment right. They can still keep on interrogating you, asking you questions. It's important to, instead of just saying nothing, to specifically say, I don't want to speak with you, I want to remain silent, right? This specifically conveys to them that you don't want to talk and you want to invoke that right that you have. And then they generally will leave you alone until you have an attorney present. So you would remain silent, ask for that attorney, and then they're supposed to, at that point, leave you alone until you have access to your attorney. And it's also important to note that immigration court is not the same as criminal court. So in criminal court, you have access to a public defender. If you can't afford an attorney, they'll give you one, right? But in immigration court, it's not the same because we're not dealing with criminal matters. This is all what's called like civil law. And so it's, you have a right to hire one, but you're not given one. So it's important to, before you're ever in this situation, if you fear that this is a possibility for you, immigration detention, to already have a relationship with an immigration attorney, to possibly memorize his or her phone number, so that you can be able to contact them if you're ever in this situation. Yeah. So best practices, it's always important to be as prepared as possible, because then it reduces a situation where you're panicked, don't know what to do, maybe end up saying something that might be harmful for you, or doing something that might be harmful. So it's important to have a safety plan, carry your proof of status if you're required to. Like if you're a non-citizen, you should always carry proof of your status if you have status. Memorizing phone numbers, like I mentioned, of lawyer, family, since the phones are often taken and you don't have access to your contacts, right? So that's why it's important to memorize. I've seen some people write it down on their, bodies. If that's if you're able to do that, then go ahead. But it's always better to memorize it. Same with CBP. It's best not to lie to them, right? It's ironically they can lie to you, but you can't lie to them. So that's just the situation. It's best to just be honest or say nothing at all. And it's very important not to sign anything without an attorney present, because sometimes they try to trick people into giving up their status voluntarily, which is, unfortunate. So that's why it's important to, if they, might pressure you to sign something, to refuse that sort of request. And it's always important to stay calm. It'll protect you. It'll, you'll be able to reflect if you have any. You'll be able to, reflect before saying anything that might be harmful to you. And this is also pretty important, so be mindful of, who you share your information about your immigration status to. Any statement made to a third party, ICE could use that as a basis for, detaining you. And this information could, spread quickly. This also would include online information, right? This could all be shared with immigration authorities. If someone, has a grudge against you for whatever reason, they could always be like, okay, so-and-so doesn't have status, overstayed their visa, is undocumented, whatever, and that, could prove harmful to you. So it's better to try to keep this information as private as possible. And yeah, so be mindful of who knows your status, what you put in writing, things like that. This is just a recap for this latter portion. So it's important to remain silent. You always have that right at any stage. to speak to an attorney if you might be at risk or you fear like a loved one is at risk, and to never sign anything without them present, and to request a phone call. You can contact your country's consulate if you're from abroad, right? So you always have a right to do that. The consulate might be able to help you with your situation. These are some resources, to some phone numbers that can be contacted if anyone you or someone you know has been impacted by ICE raids. So these two numbers are helpful. One second. I'll just keep it on that. Yeah, so I'll keep it on this page. We can deal with any questions that people might have about either of the two topics, or yeah.
Would you recommend if ICE was to stop you when you're walking on the street,
Yeah.
public area?
Yeah.
What rights do you have?
Yeah, so at any point, you can, if you were encountered by ICE, if they just stop you as you're walking down the street, you can always ask them, if you think it'll help your situation, which could be helpful to just say that, if you are a U.S. citizen, to just say, I'm a U.S. citizen, don't mess with me. Or if you have the proof, you can just show it at that moment. You can also choose not to say anything and just ask, am I being detained? If they say no, you can just continue walking, right? You don't have to do anything in that case. If they, you can, show proof of your status if you're not a U.S. citizen. Although the best practice is generally to ask if you're being detained. If they say no, just to leave the situation. If they escalate, to show proof of your status, and just generally not just giving up any information beyond that, because then that might be harmful in the future. It's best to stay calm. Don't escalate the situation. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of very awful outcomes with people in specifically Minnesota, but also across the country, where there's been a lot of tension between these people and ICE agents, and it has ended badly in a handful of cases. And so you should decide. Of course, if someone wants to engage in activism and things like that, you always obviously have a right to do that. And if you want to engage in actions that would try to keep the community safe and things like that, but just always be aware of the risk. We've seen, unfortunately, some people have been shot for doing these kinds of things. So it's very important to be mindful of those situations, and just to try not to escalate anything and be too aggressive or hostile, because that might cause harm for you. So, any other questions? Or yeah. Yeah, so essentially the administrative warrant, all it really says is that they have they're authorized by the agency to detain a specific non-citizen, but it doesn't give them authority to enter a private place or to search anything or to seize property or things like that. That's something that would require a judicial warrant, and so they take advantage of some people's ignorance on the topic, and they just show this other warrant that they have for the arrest of a particular person, to kind of convince people into giving them entry to their private place, but that doesn't give them any authorization to enter a private place, to search any private place or anything like that. So it's really not useful for any other purpose other than to actually arrest a specific person. Yeah. So they're supposed to show you a warrant if they, want to enter a private place, but we've seen examples where they just refuse to do that, and that's a very, complex situation. It just requires using your best judgment. You might be in a situation where they're like, we're gonna, we have a warrant to enter, and we're gonna break down your door if you don't give us permission to enter your house. So you have to decide, should I open the door so they don't break down my door, or should I, let them do that and then face any sort of legal consequences that they might face if they actually don't have a warrant? That's just something that you have to decide for yourself. I mean, but you don't have to give them permission if they don't present you the judicial warrant. And I'm also available afterwards if you have any more questions. But these are just some things that we encourage the community to get involved in the various elections taking place. I'm not sure if this masjid is part of the district that's having a special election soon for Congress, but that's coming up in about a week or so or something like that. But of course there's elections every year, so it's always good to be engaged and involved with the local and state and national elections. These are just our social media if anyone wants to follow us. We have volunteer opportunities, we have a newsletter, there's also a QR code for the newsletter on the table. And yeah, these are our Know Your Rights materials in pamphlet form, so that we have one for the airport and travel and one for the ICE encounters. This QR code should give you access to that, and also it's on our website, and then we also have the pamphlets on a table over there. I can bring some for the sisters if they're interested. I can maybe put some here. And yeah, so thank you so much. If you have any questions, you can always come here, but I really appreciate your attention.